The moment the alert flashed across the palace's ultra-secure network, everything changed. Not a rumor, not a whisper from tabloids, not another royal gossip drifting through London's elite circles. A verified medical diagnosis, and the name attached to it froze the palace in absolute silence. Prince Louis. For years, the youngest child of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been presented to the world as the cheerful, playful spark of the royal family. The little prince known for mischievous smiles and energetic appearances. But behind the golden walls of Buckingham Palace, insiders now claim a completely different story had been unfolding. One buried under years of secrecy, protocol, and fear. And when that internal medical alert surfaced, the shockwaves were immediate. Phones began vibrating across restricted palace offices. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Doors quietly closed. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Because this message carried something the monarchy had tried desperately to contain. A diagnosis. A diagnosis that, according to internal reports, had been whispered about behind palace walls for years before becoming impossible to ignore. The silence that followed the notification was unlike anything palace veterans had ever experienced. One long-serving staff member later admitted that even during previous royal scandals, the palace never felt this tense. Because this wasn't a scandal. This was something far more dangerous. It was truth. And suddenly the past began looking very different. Observers who once laughed at Prince Louis's playful behavior during royal appearances began replaying old footage with unsettling new eyes. Moments once dismissed as childhood energy now appeared strangely calculated. A stumble here, a delayed reaction there, a brief pause before responding to someone speaking. Individually, they meant nothing. But together, they formed a pattern. One palace insider described the realization as watching a puzzle finally assemble itself. Years earlier, small incidents had quietly begun raising concern among palace physicians. Prince Louis sometimes appeared momentarily disoriented. At times, he seemed to lose focus mid-interaction. His reaction times occasionally lagged behind other children his age. None of it dramatic enough to alarm the public, but enough to trigger concern behind closed doors. Palace doctors initially dismissed the signs as harmless developmental quirks. Children grow differently, some mature slower than others. But by the time Louis was barely 3 years old, physicians could no longer ignore what they were seeing. Something deeper was happening. And that's when the palace quietly launched what insiders now describe as one of the most secretive medical investigations in royal history. No public announcement, no official record, just quiet consultations hidden beneath layers of royal protocol. Inside the palace medical archives, the investigation would eventually receive a classified name: Project Solstice. A project so sensitive that only a handful of people were allowed to know it existed. Because the implications weren't simply medical, they were constitutional. According to sources familiar with the investigation, doctors began observing a pattern of neurological symptoms, subtle but persistent. Moments of disconnection, delayed motor responses, occasional tremors when performing simple movements, and sometimes brief lapses where Louis appeared disconnected from his surroundings. Each sign alone meant very little, but together they formed something far more concerning. The palace realized they could not rely solely on their internal medical team, so they quietly began assembling an international network of specialists. A pediatric neurogeneticist was flown in from Sweden. A child neurologist known for consulting on high-risk neurological disorders arrived from Canada. An Israeli medical expert specializing in early detection of degenerative genetic conditions was brought into the project. Every one of them signed lifetime confidentiality agreements. Their visits were disguised under diplomatic or charity-related travel records. Their names never appeared in palace medical logs. And the reason was simple. If word of Louis's condition leaked, the consequences could ripple through the entire monarchy, because the diagnosis being investigated carried terrifying possibilities. Early onset neurological degeneration, a disorder known for being unpredictable, cruel, and sometimes progressive. Some children with the condition remained stable for years. Others slowly experienced decline in cognitive or motor abilities. No one could say exactly what Louis's future might hold. But one thing was clear. If the diagnosis was confirmed, the monarchy would face a question it had never prepared to answer. What happens if a royal heir cannot fulfill royal duties? Inside palace corridors, this possibility sent shockwaves through senior advisors. Because monarchy isn't only about tradition, it's about perception, strength, stability, authority. The image of an heir struggling with a degenerative neurological disorder could create a narrative the institution might never recover from. So secrecy became the strategy. Every public appearance involving Louis was carefully choreographed. Camera angles were planned. Staff stood nearby, ready to intervene if anything seemed unusual. Royal schedules were quietly adjusted. Sometimes appearances were canceled altogether. Public explanations always remained simple. The children are enjoying private family time, but inside palace walls, the reality was far more intense. Prince Louis was undergoing constant monitoring, behavioral observations, neurological assessments, development tracking, every subtle change recorded, every medical consultation archived inside the growing Project Solstice files. Even palace staff were kept in the dark. Those who asked questions were discouraged from pressing further. One former employee reportedly received sharp criticism simply for asking whether Louis might need more rest during a busy royal event. The message was clear. Silence was expected and most obeyed. But secrets, no matter how carefully protected, always create pressure. And inside Buckingham Palace, that pressure was building. One of the first visible cracks came quietly. Louis's longtime nanny suddenly left the royal household. The official explanation was personal reasons, but insiders whispered a different story. They claimed the growing secrecy surrounding the young prince had made her deeply uncomfortable. Soon after, public observers began noticing something else. Catherine, Princess of Wales, appeared less frequently at public events. Her absences were explained as family priorities, but those close to the palace say she had become fiercely protective of Louis, shielding him from public scrutiny, spending long nights beside his bed, privately pleading with doctors for clarity about his future. Behind the calm smile the world saw, insiders claim Catherine was carrying an unimaginable emotional burden. And Prince William? According to several palace staff members, he became unusually withdrawn. Some say he even disappeared temporarily from internal communications during particularly tense periods of the investigation, because every new medical report carried the same haunting uncertainty. No one knew what Louis's future would look like. And then came the trip that now raises even more questions. In late 2025, the royal family traveled to Switzerland for what palace officials described as a family wellness retreat. But insiders now claim the trip had a far more serious purpose. Prince Louis underwent extensive testing at a specialized neurodevelopmental medical facility. The visit was conducted under extraordinary privacy measures. No press coverage, no official documentation, just quiet consultations and weeks of testing. Doctors monitored everything: cognitive responses, motor coordination, neurological activity. And when the results were compiled, the conclusion reportedly confirmed the palace's worst fears. Prince Louis had been diagnosed years earlier with a rare early-onset neurological disorder, a diagnosis so sensitive it was sealed as a state-level secret, because if it ever became public, the consequences might reach far beyond one child. They could reshape the monarchy itself. And for years, that secret remained buried inside Project Solstice, until someone inside the palace decided the silence had lasted long enough. Someone who had been watching everything, recording everything, documenting every hidden detail the palace tried to conceal. A diary, hundreds of pages, private observations, medical routines, behavioral notes, even emotional moments no outsider was ever meant to witness. And when that diary finally surfaced among insiders, it revealed something even more shocking than the diagnosis itself. Because buried inside those pages was proof that the palace hadn't just been protecting a child. They had been protecting an institution at any cost. And the final entry in that diary hinted at something that could shake the royal family even further. Something that raises one terrifying question. Was Prince Louis the only royal secret hidden inside Project Solstice? Or was this just the first layer of a much deeper truth waiting to explode? The moment that diary began circulating among a handful of palace insiders, the atmosphere inside royal corridors changed in a way that even the most seasoned staff could feel immediately. Because until that moment, the entire situation surrounding Prince Louis had been controlled, managed, contained. But the diary was different. It wasn't written by a royal advisor. It wasn't drafted by palace communications teams. It wasn't filtered through the careful machinery of royal public relations. It was raw observation, unfiltered, and painfully honest. Page after page described moments no camera had ever captured. Small, quiet events inside palace rooms that never appeared in royal photographs or official footage. Moments where the young prince appeared, confused for a few seconds before regaining focus. Moments where simple instructions had to be repeated twice. Moments where palace staff were instructed to subtly redirect his attention during rehearsals for public appearances. Individually, they were harmless, but together they revealed something chilling, a pattern. And the diary didn't stop at describing describing Louis. It revealed the machinery surrounding him, the constant monitoring, the rehearsed interactions before public appearances, the instructions whispered to staff minutes before cameras arrived, the quiet hand signals used between palisades to intervene if Louis appeared overwhelmed. Everything had been carefully choreographed, everything designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy, and reading those entries felt less like reviewing a royal schedule and more like reading the script of an invisible performance. Because behind every smiling photograph, behind every cheerful wave from the young prince, a small army of staff had been working silently to protect two things at the same time: a child and an institution. According to insiders who later described the contents, one section of the diary was particularly heartbreaking. It described the late-night routine inside Louis's bedroom. After the palace lights dimmed and the corridors fell silent, Catherine, Princess of Wales, would sometimes remain seated beside his bed long after everyone else had left, not speaking, not moving, just watching him sleep, and occasionally wiping tears from her face when she thought no one was looking, because the public version of Catherine, poised, calm, composed, was only half the story. Behind closed doors, she was a mother watching doctors debate a future they could not predict, and the emotional strain was enormous. The diary recorded how she repeatedly asked physicians the same question over and over again: will he be okay? But the answers were never simple. Doctors could explain the condition, they could describe possible outcomes, but certainty? That was something no one could give. Some children with similar neurological conditions live relatively normal lives for years. Others slowly develop difficulties with coordination, speech, or cognitive processing. The unpredictability was the most frightening part. It meant every milestone, every birthday, every school year came with a silent question mark hanging above it. Inside the palace, the emotional toll spread beyond the immediate family. Staff members began feeling the tension too. Royal schedules had to be rewritten repeatedly. Public appearances involving Louis became increasingly rare. When he did appear, preparations were meticulous. Shorter events, carefully controlled environments, staff positioned just outside camera frames, and even the way Louis interacted with crowds was quietly adjusted. What once looked like spontaneous moments between a young prince and the public were now carefully guided interactions. The palace never acknowledged any of it publicly, but inside those walls, everyone understood the stakes. Because this wasn't simply about protecting a child's privacy, it was about protecting the perception of the monarchy itself. The British royal family has always operated on a delicate balance: tradition, stability, continuity. If the public begins questioning whether an heir can carry out royal duties, that balance becomes fragile, and palace advisors were painfully aware of how quickly narratives could spiral out of control. They had seen it happen before: royal controversies, family disputes, media storms that took years to recover from. But a medical condition affecting a young prince? That was something entirely different. It wasn't scandal. It was vulnerability. And vulnerability is something institutions built on power often struggle to reveal. So the palace doubled down on secrecy. Project Solstice grew larger. More reports, more assessments, more consultations with international experts. The medical archive became one of the most guarded files within the royal system. Because if that moment comes, it won't just reveal the private struggles of one young prince. It could redefine how the world sees the royal family forever.